one of the opportunities that you and I have is that Daniel and I have spent our careers. I'm a little older, so a longer career in teaching this kind of content to graduate students and practitioners. And it's been this amazing moment for we've seen people really want to consume and understand the research behind certain topics. And I think the challenge oftentimes is this tension between making something bottom shelf and approachable while not oversimplifying it into something that it's not. Does that make sense? And so even thinking about something like turnover and retention is it's an interesting whole story when you look at all the research that's out there. So initially what I wanted to do is to talk to you about what we know about job satisfaction, and at least to get into one specific area. And there was a guy named Hertzberg who did some research years ago on this topic of job satisfaction. This kind of one of the things that's amazing to talk with business leaders like you is just realizing that to watch the light bulbs go off in you as you hear something like this. But just think about this for just a moment. What Hertzberg found that was really interesting is that there was something going on with job satisfaction that people previously had not thought about. So let me just frame it this way: that think about this, that there is job dissatisfaction and there is satisfaction. And so let me quantify that for you. Let's imagine that dissatisfaction is like a -5. I hate my job. Okay, end of the game. I just hate my job. And that a 0 is, my job's okay. All right, so a -5 to a 0, and that job satisfaction is going from a 0 to a +5, to this like, I love working in this business. I love working for Todd Allred, and being a part of Allred is just a huge thing. So here's what Hertzberg found. Think about this. We had assumed before that job dissatisfaction and satisfaction were on a continuum from -5 to +5. What Hertzberg found was that this possibility that those two things are different things. And the reason why he came to that conclusion is because what he found was there were different things predicting each of them. So in other words, the things that keep you from being dissatisfied are different than the things that keep you from being satisfied. All right. So that there were different predictors. So then you're asking yourself, so what are the predictors? And Hertzberg called them what keeps you from being dissatisfied. In other words, from moving you from a -5 to a 0 is what he described as hygiene factors. All right. So hygiene factors, it's kind of self-explanatory when you think about what that means. But one of the foundational things, and Kathy, you mentioned this, that is a hygiene factor is pay. So it's not that pay doesn't matter, but what Hertzberg found was that pay is something that will never get you to a 2, 3, 4, or 5. I tell you that because of this. This fallacy is just rampant across CEOs of small to mid-sized businesses. And I think it's one thing for you to say it, and it's one thing for you to actually believe it and communicate it. Like, because it's like you've heard all day, like managers will say, I have an open door policy, which means nothing if your door's closed. All right. So you can say that all day long. Like, you should trust me. Well, I don't trust you. It's like all those kinds of things. So what I'm inviting you to begin to think about as it impacts actually your mindset and the practices you have in place is that pay is a hygiene factor. Pay is important, but it gets you to a 0. All right. And it's not that it's not important. So don't be dismissing that, but it gets you to a 0. And I think there's a working assumption, and probably at least half, if not more, of the CEOs we work with that like, well, if people come because they're paid well. And it comes up when other people go to work there because they're paid well. It's like, well, that you may think even people looking for jobs will assume that. My sons initially were looking for jobs that they just like, where's the best pay above minimum wage in the city of Seattle? Like, that's what they were looking for. And they very quickly, when they got their first 2 jobs, realized, oh, my manager's great or my manager's horrible. And that's what my next job, you know what I mean? They're going to look for something different. So then you're asking yourself, so what are the other things? So Hertzberg called them motivators, like motivating factors. And one of the primary motivators, just a couple of things that we're going to get into more deeply around retention, and also, so what is it? Why do people stay? Why do people leave? But is one of the primary things is meaningful work. meaningful work. And we're going to talk more about what that means in just a minute, because it's one thing to say, oh, meaningful work. Well, how do you get meaningful work? Like, how does a person perceive that? So we're going to get into that in a moment. But the other thing is, like, is this relationship to a manager, like a manager who, this is my language around that research, is like a manager who sees me. You know what I mean? Who sees me? Like, not just like sees the things I'm good at, is having those conversations, is also saying, here's some things I think that might help if you worked on these things. A manager who asks me, like, what do you want to experience next? A manager who says, how are things going? A manager who talks to me about where the business is going and asks me questions, says, does that make sense? Can we talk? Like, a manager who sees me. And so it's like, you think about those things, and then the next question, of course, is how do you get there? But that's the first thing I want to throw out there, is this realization that there are different things predicting us getting to a zero than the things that take us to, like, oh my gosh, like where Adam Finch says he's a 3, 4, or 5, and he says, I want to tell this story everywhere. I want to tell the story of why I work in this weird little business. I'm not saying any of you worked in, we all work in weird little businesses. I want to tell that story where people go, and there's an interesting connection I'll make to how those hiring things happen in just a moment. But Daniel, that's my, thank you for that.
Great. So with that primer, I'm going to take us deep quickly, and this is not going to be the Forbes 2 steps to turnover. I want to get into.
It's not mild leadership, Daniel.
Not mild leadership. So I'm going to pull up what's called a meta-analysis. What that basically means is there are people who have devoted their entire life to studying something like turnover, and then somebody else comes along and says, I'm going to aggregate all the stuff that all the people have looked at turnover and try to put it into some summaries. And so I'm going to share with you 2 pieces of a research article and talk you through them. And then Rob's gonna take some of the practical pieces, but you'll start to see that -5, those motivators and those hygiene factors right away. So the first thing I want to show is from this article, and we'll send a link to it as well. This article is about 10 years old, but the research is still pretty relevant today and replicated a bunch. And so don't get concerned about the date, because while there might be certain factors that are changing turnover today, it's not that dramatically different is what we continue to see. And so this article, I love it. They summarized 5 misconceptions. I'm going to walk you through them quickly and then get into some of the specific things that they saw. The first is that all turnover, misconception 1, is the same and it's bad. Turnover is a lot more complicated than does somebody leave or stay. Different roles cost more. If Rob leaves tomorrow, don't leave Rob, that's going to impact me a lot in the business. So different turnover impacts us differently, and the cost of a different role, we know this, but just calling it out. Not all turnover is the same, and it's not all bad. Part of that too is that I shared with a couple folks a moment ago that everyone leaves at some point. And so turnover might not even be the best way to think about it. It's not about do people turn over, but who turns over when and at what rate might be a different way of thinking about it. Misconception 2, and Rob just mentioned this, people quit because of pay. We had one CEO that said, well, my people are coin operated. Okay, so we know money matters. If you're grossly underpaid or you can't pay your bills, you're gonna move for that dollar extra per hour. But assuming, I'm going to make the assumption today that none of you are so grossly underpaying your people that they're only going to leave because of pay. So if we have if that's the case, that's a different conversation. It's like pay and pay satisfaction, they're predictive, but they're not the biggest predictors. So pay matters, but it's not the only thing. Misconception 3, people leave because they're dissatisfied with their jobs. So satisfaction matters, but it's not the only reason. Kind of like Rob mentioned, there's different things that will get somebody to that 0 versus that 5. And so part of this is thinking of, okay, what are the different reasons for a particular person? It's easy to say, oh, they didn't like it, so they left. Well, why did they not? What's specifically making up their dissatisfaction or lack of purpose is interesting. Misconception 4, there's little that managers can do directly. This is huge. There's actually a lot of things that you as a leader, as an executive, or as a manager of particular people can do specifically to impact turnover, what we'll get into. And this just, I think, last one harmonizes so well with our wild approach that there is no one size fits all. So even as we talk about, as we lay out some of these things today and some of these strategies that we know work, the interesting conversation becomes, well, how does this look like? What does this look like for your business specifically? So we're going to give you some time to reflect on that, and we'll have deeper conversation on the back half of this today. But there is no one size fits all. There are certain things we know are more effective. Turnover looks a little bit different for each business, but the context matters, and thinking about what does this look like for you uniquely is what's going to get us some mileage. So let me double click a little bit deeper. Those make sense. Here are the things that they showed are the strongest relationships with turnover. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but I'm going to give you some highlights. That line in the middle is 0. The line on the right, the lines on the right are what are the things that predict somebody leaving? Like if this is in place, it's related to somebody leaving. And the things on the left are what are the things that if it's in place are related with a decreased likelihood of somebody leaving. So to oversimplify it, stuff on the right means people are going to be leaving. It predicts people leaving. Stuff on the right predicts people staying. That's the oversimplified piece, or not leaving. So, and they cluster these together. So onboarding, for example, weighted application blanks basically is fancy for saying a carefully constructed application process. There's stuff you can figure out in the application process or the recruitment that tells you if somebody's going to leave. So Kathy, you and I were chatting in the breakout group, like, and there's a whole another session on this, but there's specific things that you can predict ahead of time. Oh, if this is in place, the person might not stay. So that's interesting. Socialization tactics, meaning, do you have really good onboarding processes? Do you have a way for people to feel like they're actually understanding and learning the organization? Or is it a sink or swim, just throw them in there and see if they figure it out, is one thing. Let me press a little bit deeper. Role job characteristics. So role clarity. Rob's can get into this more, and you see the opposite, role conflict. So role clarity is kind of what it sounds like. Do you know what your job is? Do you know what you're expected to do? And do you know what success is and how it's rewarded? Like, how do I know if I'm doing a good job? Matters. Role conflict basically means you're not quite sure what your job is or somebody else's job. So you're not quite sure, is this what my job is or is it something different? So when clarity is there, it decreases turnover. It's related to decreased turnover. When conflict in your role is there, like you might be asked to do 2 very different roles. I was part of a university where they had a job that was budget manager and admissions, like completely different functions. So that person had conflict in their role, and they had turnover again and again and again. Promotion opportunities, that matters again. But look at that pay. Like it matters, pay and pay satisfaction, but it's not that huge. It's one of the factors. We go down to leadership and relationship. So the leader member exchange, Rob will get into more like the relationship between the boss, satisfaction with their work group, the supervisor, and like what it's like to be there. Stress matters, but not a huge amount. Communication, participation, decision making. So are you just taking orders, or do you feel like you have some way to influence what's going on? Distributive justice, Kathy, you and I chat about this before, or Kathy B. And this basically, do people feel like things are fair? So I think my kids coming to me and saying, why did he get that? Well, then it gets kind of comical. Okay, so I love this one, tenure. If you've been with an organization for a while, the longer you've been there, the longer you're likely to be there, which is kind of funny. I just get a kick out of that. If you have kids, or if you're older, you're more likely you're not gonna jump ship that quickly. Kind of funny, but makes sense, kind of true. And then some other factors that are not really that big of a deal. Attitudes are interesting. Organizational commitments. One executive I worked with, he termed this people are all in. Like they're just bought into the company, the mission, where things are going, what the organization is about. Job satisfaction is meaningful, and Rob talked about that a little bit. And then this is my favorite list, the withdrawal process. So sometimes research tells you things that make sense, but they don't tell you why. And so Rob's gonna get a little bit into the why. So I love this final category. Turnover intentions, handedly the biggest predictor. So if you're thinking of leaving, you're probably gonna leave. Which I like, that makes sense. Or job search behaviors. If you're applying for jobs, you're probably gonna leave at some point, which I think are kind of comical, but they make sense and begs a question. So what are some of the things that would get in front of that before somebody actually goes? If there was a punchline for this, for this whole chart, and I'll send this out, some of you are going, okay, well, what does this mean? Well, it means a couple things. One, there is no silver bullet. It's not like, well, people are only leaving because of the Great Resignation. They're being awakened to the possibilities. That might be one reason, but it's not the only reason. So there's a deeper, nuanced whole story, and it probably depends on your unique context. There might be certain things on this list you're like, that's a low-hanging fruit. And there might be other things that combined together might actually matter the most for retention. Okay, so Rob, I'm gonna ask you to take a little bit deeper. This describes what's happening. It doesn't prescribe what we should do. So take us a little bit deeper from descriptive to prescriptive.
All right. So I'm gonna go off road for a moment. Realize that this is being recorded, so we'll send this out to some folks. Anybody have any ahas looking at this, or maybe affirmations or something that you would want to say? It's okay if not, but if someone wants to say, like, I noticed this. Anybody?
I think for me, there's a little bit, I can see the one where role conflict and role clarity is so important, because as we're trying to hire people in our small organization, even just like figuring out a job description for what one of our current employees does is so difficult, because they do so much, because we're a small organization. And so I can see how that poses a problem down the road, is if people aren't sure what their specific role is, or they're doing too many roles, then they're gonna feel pretty lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even just a simple job description, right, Caitlin? Like just something, even if it's very simple, can really help. What else? What else do y'all notice?
I think it was just for me affirming that it's complex and it's nuanced. Like, I think I know that, but seeing the data is just affirming of that, right? And kind of what you were saying, Daniel, that it's going to be so much on our context and those sorts of things. And so, I mean, I'm excited to see how, okay, based on this context, here's some ideas for what to do. But I think, again, I think that was affirming, and that pay one that you talked about. I hear that so much here, and we're raising our pay like there's no tomorrow, right? Like, give them this attendance bonus and, you know, $5 more in this location. And, you know, there's only so much you can do as a company that you can afford. And to see that that's not the most pivotal thing is also super insightful for me.
Anybody else?
I feel like we've implemented, well, based on your advice over the last couple of years, much more clarity in job description, role clarity, even getting descriptions of what I do versus what Derek does versus what each of the employees do. And still with the turnover we've had, again, I mentioned before, I think I'm just hiring the wrong people.
Yeah.
Because the people that are staying, I can see how this all fits. And even with Karen, my assistant, who is quitting at the end of tax season, except she's not really quitting because she's going to come back in 1 or 2 days. Well, 1 day a month. And now she told me last week, maybe 2 days a month. So she's not even
give you a year notice.
Yeah. And she gave me a year notice, right? So, you know, she said, I'm going to stay through next tax season, and then we're changing her job out of bed and whatever. So you know, she has all the things of being committed to the company and all that kind of stuff. And I have 3 part-time people they've worked here for a long time and they're super committed, but they're still a key employee that I'm not hiring the right person.
Yeah. So
I don't know
thank
where
you.
that fits on here. Yeah.
Thank you, Eva. I think we all can relate to that. I love that she's chiming in the background. So one of the things to keep in mind with research, okay, is that this research is important. And it's, if we wanted to make some assumptions about most people, this is some interesting data. But keep in mind that this research and most statistics are in some ways based on averages. And I think to hold that way of looking at most people without over prescribing to the individual, we call it focusing on the one with an eye to the many. That's the way we describe that, is you know what I'm saying? So for example, I heard recently that when the military was designing jets in the 1950s, that was as they were working with their contractors building the jets, that they built the jets to the average pilot. And the problem was that what they found when they looked across the population, that none of the jet's fittings actually fit the average pilot, because the problem was the pilots had different size, different lengths of arms, left arm's longer than right arm, legs were different legs. So you had all kinds of body types. And so if you just look at averages and that's the only thing you do, you end up designing a cockpit, because they realized they had the best technology in the world, the best pilots in the world, but they weren't performing as well because the cockpits weren't designed right. So they found that in many ways they were designing cockpits that fit no pilot. And so the application of simple things that were happening in automobiles, like adjustable seats, changed everything about these $1 aircraft. And so that's why I hold that as you look at this chart. Remember that. But it doesn't mean that there isn't important information here. So as you look at this, and let me just pinpoint it on 3 things, like role clarity, leader member exchange, and then organizational commitment down at the bottom. So what's interesting about this is, think about this. These are dependent variables. These are outcomes. These are not the secret sauce. And I say that with a dramatic pause. These are outcomes. They are not the secret sauce. And the reason why that's important to listen, I think, to hear for each of us, is that what we hear oftentimes out in sort of the public, out in the square and out at, on Instagram or on some social media post, is we hear a person saying these outcomes and everybody goes, yeah, it's about commitment. Are you committed to this business? Do you know what I'm saying? We say trust is important. It's trust. Your employees should trust you. The leaders need to trust the organization. Trust. What it doesn't, and we want that because it's simple. What it does not do anything for us around is, what does it actually mean to build trust? Do you hear me? Because I had a CEO recently who went in front of his leadership team and he said this. He said, and he watched some TED Talk about the importance of people believing in their work. And so he went in front of his leadership team and he said, do you believe in what we're trying to do here? And I thought, when he told me that, I thought, okay, he's doing great stuff. I'm not slamming that. He's doing great stuff in his business. So he's having great conversations. But in that one moment, what I asked him is, what if they say no? Because the way that organizational commitment is built is not through telling people that they should be committed. No one wants to be should have anyway. The question is, how do you begin to build commitment? How do you build trust? How do you build, like, leader member exchange, for example, it's this, like, literally, here's the definition. I don't know if I love this or not, but it is interesting. It's this, it's a theory that suggests that leaders and followers develop unique relationships based on their social exchanges. And the quality of these exchanges within an organization can influence employee outcomes. So it's like, but the fundamentals of it is that it's a social thing. It's psychological, it's relational, it's whether or not we know each other. Do we see each other? Do we trust each other? Do we have each other's backs? Do we believe we have each other's backs? It's all these things that go deeper. And so when you look at these 3 things, and then let me just speak to role clarity for just a second. That is, there's a lot of ways to talk about this, but the literature, like the research around this, is deep. Like, some of that's related to task identity. Do I know, am I clear about what the task is? And so often in businesses, we just fail to write a simple job description. We all do. And so if we did that, that might be a huge thing. But it also includes alignment. So this issue of, like, Do I understand how what I'm doing is contributing to the larger organization? And most of us do not have that conversation often enough. You know what I'm saying? Where it's a simple cadence of asking a person, so tell me about your understanding of where we're going as a business. The person says, I don't know. I'd love to talk about that. And so we have that conversation. And then all of a sudden, alignment is something that is built, not given. It's developed, not provided. And so with all three of these things, and so just to give you some more fodder for our breakout, I'm going to jump in with you, because anybody who's running a business who says like, and I'm not sitting here going, I run a business, right? So if I'm not continuing to learn about these things, we can always improve on these three things. But let me give you some of the secret sauce behind these things. Like, this is why for us, this is a huge thing for wild leaders. This is why we built a system that embeds in your business that some of you are using, or that embeds with your team. It doesn't even have to be a big business, but that you would have regular conversations based on what we know is important from decades of research, that we know there's sort of different conversations that we know are common, but the way that people think about these is where it's different. So, you know what I mean? Where people get to bring their own mapping onto that conversation, but at least those conversations are taking place on a regular basis. And so when you look at leader member exchange, it's why in so many cases we start with the leaders. If we could increase their capacity to show some level of kind of strategic and appropriate vulnerability, that it begins to build that connective tissue that creates what leader member exchange is all about, so that we not only have social exchanges, but we see each other. I had something installed in my house. I'm not going to say anything in case this organization ever watches this, but I had something installed in my house last week, and the installer came after it was sold to us, and it wasn't done quite perfectly. And I realized, very quickly, because I do this work every day, that the salesperson, or probably people, were not talking with the installer. And that's an easy conversation, but it takes a system for development and seeing one another where those conversations begin to take place. So one thing is, the first thing I would say is like strategically would say, develop your leaders. The second thing is creating meaningful work. Creating meaningful work is pathing an individual in your business or your nonprofit to have them in a continual process of understanding how what they do is adding to what the organization is about. And that's a conversation that's not prescribed, but invited. So it's like I know, Kathy, you've experienced this in the well, both Kathys in some ways, but it's like in the wild profile, there's a part of the questioning process that says, where is your organization going this year? What are you trying to accomplish? And then there's another question, is what is your group within the organization trying to accomplish? And the next question is, what are you doing that's contributing to that organization's mission? And over time, that's building this alignment that isn't given, but then the employee is saying like, I'm making, because every person whose face I'm looking at is going to make sense out of that conversation in their own way. And so building that alignment is so important. So creating meaningful work is that process of conversations that build that depth of understanding. And then finally is this, and it's like, Todd, when I got a chance to speak to your folks, and I was saying like, that was my attempt. I'm on the outside. I remember, Todd, that moment where I was walking out and I said, by the way, what you do is so important, because without you, I don't have water in my house. You remember that moment? I was just like, that was my perspective on your business. I was saying like, I am so grateful for what you all do, and then inviting them into a conversation, what that looks like. And then the final thing, that's creating meaningful work, is the second thing. The last thing is becoming a destination. And this is where I point straight at that organizational commitment idea, is that this question of why I'm in it and inviting me into that is so critical. And when I say becoming a destination around this, and this is related to this concept of turnover, is what I want for every one of your organizations and for ours is that everybody wants to work there. Because I want them to say, there's this weird little organization, business or nonprofit. I say little because unless you're a $1 billion in revenue, like, it's small to mid-sized businesses where you go like, you may not heard of it, but it is an awesome place to work. You think it's just going to be about X, you know what I mean? But let me tell you what it's actually going to be like. And then so the last bit is becoming a destination, a place where people want to go work, that is, I have some skills in this industry. And so there's a place like that. And then the last thing, Daniel, is I wanted to point out something at the end of this article that I think was fascinating. Toward the end, there's a list of kind of how-tos. And one of the things that the research was also clear about is that your best source of, and one of the biggest predictors of people staying, I think I'm saying this right, Daniel, it's toward the end of that, is employee referrals. So employee referrals, think about it this way, is not just your best source of future employees, but it's your best source of future employees, the right employees who will stay. Because they'll be drawn to the culture because of who you are. And so I think I look at every one of your faces, and we all know this, right? Our best referral for someone, you know, is going to be who Claire knows. But because Claire knows the business and she believes in the culture, that she's going to go tell the story to people who not only will be the right people, but they'll be the right people that will stay. And that's something that I saw at the end of this article when I was looking even this morning, Daniel. It was interesting.
That's good. It's good. I love it. Okay. There's a lot to think about there. A lot to go deep.